First of all, those that I saw last week when I was in Madison, it was great to see everybody. Thank you for hosting me. It was a really nice couple of days. I enjoyed the mocks. Logistically, I have about half of you that I've sent your mock recordings. So everybody on Tuesday, the Wednesday group, they're coming. It's just a logistical delay on my part, so I apologize. The getting you the file, I have to put it in Dropbox or Google Drive, and it just takes a lot longer than I would like. But hopefully, if I don't have them out tonight, they'll be there tomorrow. Beyond that, this is our last kind of webinar for the fall. For your reference, you guys will continue to have access to all these materials through, probably the end of summer. You will continue to get the Archer weeklies unless you want to communicate to me that you don't want them, and then I'll be happy to take you off the list. And I know that a number of you are still in your job search phase, whether it's a full-time position or an internship. Hopefully some of this you'll be able to continue to reference. And if there are ever questions that come up, you've obviously got my email and contact info, and obviously working with Heather and Betsy and the resources you guys have on campus. So just keep all of that in mind. So to jump in to what we're going to focus on for the next hour, I wanted to kind of close out with a bit of discussion around brainstorming. So as you guys think about how we have worked through these different case activities, we've thought about, sort of instinctive ideas to solve the case problems. We've done a little bit of hypothesis identification. We've thought about structuring. We've done some work on math and market sizing. The last two sessions, we've done some mini cases, a little bit end to end. And the brainstorming piece is another element that can actually enter any type of case interview, and in general, not a formal case interview. So there are some interviewers that will just ask for your ideas about things, and that is essentially a brainstorm. They may not use that word, but it's implicitly the concept behind brainstorming. So I want to just briefly talk a little bit about what you're trying to accomplish with brainstorming, talk a little bit about how you approach brainstorming, and then we'll do a couple of practice activities. So some of the things that you guys want to consider when you have this opportunity to essentially list things. One is to show the breadth of your thinking. So this is actually a lot like the MISI concept. It's really the same concept of mutually exclusive, comprehensively exhaustive applies to brainstorming. And to really get a range of ideas that cover a set of different facets of whatever the case question or the problem is. Then there's also this balance between being practical and being creative. And to probably identify one of the biggest challenges that occurs in the interview setting when it comes to this, area of brainstorming, particularly when it's like ideas, solutions, recommendations. Many times we are not creative enough. I mean, that's some of the feedback that interviewers will give students and candidates in the interview process. And, sometimes we're trying to be conservative. Sometimes we don't want to be so bold that it might seem wacky. But in the interview setting, it's a little bit of a controlled environment. And so you want to show that creativity. You want to show boldness and kind of push the thinking, but also have a sense of the pragmatism, the practicality, the feasibility of what you're talking about. So keeping that in mind, As it flows in the interviewer, there may be specific occurrences where whoever you're interviewing with asks you, can you give me a list of ideas? What information would you like to have? Why don't you develop a set of recommendations? Can you tell me all the considerations? All of those questions are essentially getting at the same thing. You need to do a brainstorm. You could be prompted by the interviewer to do that. In other circumstances, you would proactively want to do it. So if you're working through a problem and it's one of those things where there seems to be many options, it's an opportunity for you to initiate or proactively present a brainstorm and go through and say, this would be a set of my ideas. Here's how I might prioritize them. This is the one that really jumps out at me. So the point of that is to say, sometimes you might be perfectly clear that you need to brainstorm. Other times you sort of need to seize an appropriate moment. As you're going through a brainstorming, you should think about structuring a little bit. How do you categorize, rather than just throwing up a laundry list of things? You want to try to develop a little bit of an organizing structure, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Again, you also want to be comprehensive. A brainstorm is not 2 ideas. It's probably not 3 ideas. It could be 5, 6, 7. It could be 10. Some firms, by practice, will ask you for more ideas. You'll give them a list and they will say to you, okay, great, what else? What else could you think about? And they're pushing you to try to be ever more creative, thinking about it from a different angle. You want to try to avoid looking like you're on a random walk. The other thing about a brainstorm is you want to be specific in a really balanced way. So one of the things people will do is say, hey, one of the solutions, one of the ideas, let's improve the marketing. Well, that's an incredibly generic thing, and it doesn't really mean a lot. There's 100 different things that I can interpret from that. So you want to be more specific than that. But you could also get into the weeds a little bit by saying, I want to use search engine optimization. I'm going to use this software tool or this service. That for what we're doing in an interview, depending on the setting, might be too specific. I mean, if you're interviewing for a market, like a digital marketing position, that might be relevant. So you have to kind of keep that in mind, what in your area of specialization makes sense, but don't be too generic. That's probably the biggest mistake. Another aspect is really listen to the question that's being asked. And, are you being asked for a list? Are you being asked for a couple of ideas and then to drill down? And something that I would also say is, if someone gives you the prompt, what are the considerations? What are the ideas? What information? You need to answer that question before you move on to the next stage of whatever's being discussed in the interview. Some people will take the brainstorm and they'll actually start asking a bunch of questions about it, and then you haven't really addressed my interest in having you brainstorm. So there's kind of a pause at the end of the brainstorming. And think about how you would make these ideas real. It might be necessary to explain a little bit how you would implement it. Again, that depends a little bit on the circumstances of the interview. But as you are practicing, you should always consider risks and trade-offs of the ideas, particularly if your brainstorm is around solutions or recommendations. Every path forward has pros and cons. And that, when you can think about that and present it, it shows a higher level of thinking. So what I often recommend when you're practicing, especially at this stage, don't filter your ideas. now, but for every idea that you talk about, then say to yourself, okay, what are the pros and the cons of this idea? And then eventually, when you get into the interview setting, as you've advanced your skills in this area, you'll be able to prioritize and pick out a couple of those things that fit the best or that you think are the best ideas. So keep all those things in mind and practice brainstorming. I mean, this is one of those areas where you don't need a solution. You can just sit. So I'm sitting here in a Starbucks. One of the problems that I find Starbucks has is because all the people are using these mobile applications, that if you come into the location physically, a lot of times you have to wait. Like the wait times have increased. It's like, oh, if I had to solve that problem, what would I do? And I might sit here and think of 10 things that then they could go and do about that problem. I don't really care if they're right or not, but it's that kind of activity that you can really go through on an everyday basis and practice this skill. Okay, so that's a little bit of the kind of top tips, if you will, for brainstorming. So what we're going to do now for our practice, nothing, too different than what we've done in the past. I'm going to give you guys a scenario. I will focus you on a question for the brainstorm. We're going to do a couple of different brainstorm types so that you get a feel of the different areas that you could be brainstorming. I'm going to give you guys about 2 minutes for each scenario, not a long time, but part of this is rapid thinking. I want you to aim to come up with 5 to 7 ideas. If you can push yourself to 10, even better. And then I also want you to think about how you could organize. As I was mentioning, there's some structuring and organizing that's useful in brainstorming. And you could do this potentially around, internal and external considerations. You could do it around financial or non-financial things. You could do it by function. So, supply chain, marketing, customer service, finance, human capital, technology, whatever, functional orientation. You could do it around short-term, medium-term, long-term. So there's a lot of different ways to organize. An interviewer isn't going to care how you organize. They're going to care